It's 8:25 on Wisconsin's weekday morning news. I'm Anshul Tripathi, and alongside me is David Tursek. We have an interesting topic for you today regarding political corruption in the 1920s. We're going to take your questions on political corruption during this time period soon. Right now I'm going to turn it over to David, who's going to bring up a few pieces of information that will set the stage, if you will, for this topic.
As Anshul said, I'm going to give you a few pieces of background information regarding political corruption in the 1920s. Maybe you'll develop some questions for us to answer later in the show. But right now, let's set the stage. Let's start with the Gilded Age. This was a time period that began after the Compromise of 1817 and ended in the 1890s. As Mark Twain once said, it was glittering on the surface but corrupt underneath. Two very important activities during this era were the practices of the laissez-faire approach and the spoils system. The laissez-faire approach was an economic theory supported by Thomas Jefferson in which the government was supposed to have no regulation on big businesses and were to let them grow. This allowed big businesses to control the market through monopolies. Later in the podcast, you will learn how this was reborn in the 1920s. Next, the spoils system was first developed in the 1820s during Andrew Jackson's presidency. However, it came to the attention of the society once President Garfield used it. The system was when government leaders appointed other government jobs to their friends and supporters, usually for money. President Garfield was assassinated in 1881 because he did not fulfill a promise of giving a job to someone who paid for it. Once again, later in the podcast, we will discuss how this system actually ties into an event of the 1920s. We know that both the laissez-faire approach and the spoils system were both abandoned during the Progressive Era, the time period that overlapped the Gilded Age and lasted until World War I. Presidents, such as Roosevelt and Taft, were trust-busters who broke up monopolies of big businesses. Once Garfield was assassinated, government leaders avoided hiring fellow workers based on friendships and money. Instead, we switched to a system that forced any of the people seeking a government job to meet a certain list of requirements in order to be hired. Let's address some points that will help us further our knowledge on political corruption in the 1920s. The Teapot Dome scandal. It lasted from 1921 to 1922 and was a clear example of corruption in the United States, in which oil companies used bribery at the highest levels of the government. There were many events that led to this event. During Theodore Roosevelt's reign, coal-powered ships and fueling stations were built around the world. Navy officials were looking for a more reliable and portable fuel supply because coal was not as effective. They watched other nations develop petroleum-powered ships, leading us to convert our fleets to this fossil fuel during Taft's presidency. This caused ships to have a greater range. The USS Wyoming was the first battleship converted from coal to oil in 1909. We then feared that if we ran out of oil, our Navy would be dysfunctional and would leave our country in a vulnerable position. With the support of Congress, 3 reserved oil deposits were set aside in case of a national emergency. One of these 3 reserves was near Salt Creek in northern Natrona County, Wyoming. The Teapot Dome was given its name because of the unusual formation of rocks. This unique geological feature traps beds of oil between layers of rocks. As time progressed, these federal reserves were discovered by oilmen across the country. They wrongfully desired to drill in these places. After about 11 years, in 1920, President Warren G. Harding appointed one of his poker-playing friends, Albert Fall, to be his Secretary of Interior. Does this remind you of the spoils system from the Gilded Age?
You know, I do think this could be compared to the Gilded Age, but they still have to go through a process to become a government worker because of the Pendleton Civil Service Act. Anyways, Albert Fall convinced President Harding in allowing the federal oil reserves to be in control of his Department of the Interior. Once they were in his hands, he began to make secret plans with 2 major oilmen, Edward Doheny and Harry Sinclair. These men bribed Fall into allowing them to drill in the 3 naval petroleum reserves, contradicting the law and reason of why we developed the reserves in the first place. In Wyoming, independent oilmen and later Wyoming Governor Leslie Miller saw trucks with the Sinclair Oil Company logo bringing drilling equipment into the Teapot Dome Naval Petroleum Reserve. They grew suspicious and developed a committee to investigate this unusual activity. At the same time, President Harding was on a vacation to the west, specifically to Wyoming, Alaska, and San Francisco. All of a sudden on his vacation, Harding died. Was he trying to avoid impeachment for his role in the Teapot Dome scandal? I don't mean that rhetorically. Let us know in the comment section on our website, 20th Century American History with a Twist.com. After the investigation from the Senate, Albert Fall was convicted and was sent to federal prison. However, Sinclair and Doheny were exonerated of their bribery efforts. Sinclair, being a wise guy, said this statement after the court case, quote, "You can't convict $1 million," unquote. Because of this comment, not the bribery, he was sentenced to a 9-month prison term for contempt of Congress and for his trickery involving intimidation of the jury members during the trial. After this incident, the government canceled the bribery-induced leases to Teapot Dome that were issued to Sinclair. Another important event we should mention when discussing political corruption in the 1920s is the resignation of Harry Daugherty and Charles Forbes. Harry Daugherty, graduate of the University of Michigan Law School, served on the City Council of Washington Courthouse as a member of the Republican Party. Eventually, he became a prosecuting attorney in Fayette County, Ohio. He served in the Ohio General Assembly, where he represented Fayette County from 1890 to 1894. He sought to become Ohio's governor and for a seat in the House of Representatives, but he lost these elections. However, he was still one of the most powerful members of the Republican Party in Ohio. He served as campaign manager for Warren G. Harding in 1920 because of his political prominence, and Harding, an Ohio native, won the presidential election. He then rewarded Daugherty with the position of Attorney General. Daugherty was involved in a large rumor that said he was having an affair with his personal assistant, Jess Smith, who held no formal position in the federal government, and they lived together in Washington, D.C., at the Wardman Park Hotel. During all this, Daugherty launched an investigation regarding corrupt officials in Harding's administration. Critics, mainly in the U.S. Congress, suggested Daugherty was performing illegal activities along with Smith, and as a result, Smith committed suicide to prevent from being prosecuted. Following this, the U.S. Senate launched an investigation of Daugherty, and while the investigation was going on, Daugherty resigned on March 28, 1924. The investigation ultimately failed to find any wrongdoing by Daugherty. Furthermore, Harding's administration developed a more corrupt reputation when Daugherty was involved in a bribery case that included the Alien Property Office, and he was ultimately acquitted for taking money from liquor dealers. Charles Forbes served as chairman of the Bureau of Veteran Affairs during President Harding's administration. He served in the United States Marine Corps during World War I, and had served in the military before World War I as well. Forbes was appointed to his position by President Harding simply because he was an acquaintance of Harding. Therefore, the spoil system was partially practiced, but remember, Forbes would have still had to take an exam to get into office due to the Pendleton Civil Service Act. Shortly after entering office, he embezzled almost $250 million from the Bureau of Veteran Affairs. When these actions were discovered, Forbes received a $100,000 fine and a 2-year prison sentence. This overall solidified Harding's reputation as a poor president. The Allen Bradley clock is at the top of the hour. Let's pause 10 seconds for station identification. The home of the Packers, Brewers, and Bucks. We are Wisconsin's radio station. News Radio 620 WTMJ and WTMJ HD, Milwaukee.
Welcome back, folks. Moving on to the next topic concerning political corruption during the 1920s. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was developed. It prohibited the sale, manufacturing, and transportation of the alcoholic beverages. However, it did not prohibit alcohol consumption. Prohibition catalyzed political controversy throughout the decade and stirred conflict in the growing cultural divide, as different religions viewed it as either a repression of personal freedoms or thought of it as a political reform. It was enforced more strongly in the rural areas, but was struggling in cities. At its establishment, the amendment was successful, declining the arrests of drunkenness, and the amount of consumption decreased by 30%. However, those who wanted to continue their ways of drinking became clever in ways they could do it. A few examples of this were when people illegally manufactured and sold liquor through bootlegging, smuggled across the border, and when stores or nightclubs sold alcohol, called speakeasies. As shown by all these examples, Prohibition encouraged criminal activity. A very well-known example of bootlegging and speakeasies was a gangster from Chicago named Al Capone. He earned $60 million annually, and his illegal activities caused a rise in gang violence. It ended up becoming a weaker amendment as far as its ability to control society. Later, during the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would propose a solution for the alcohol abuse and established the 21st Amendment, ending the Prohibition era and repealing the 18th Amendment.
Many different ideas that were introduced and enacted during the Gilded Age reappeared during the 1920s. As described in a prior slide, we began to follow the laissez-faire approach once again. This was due to our Republican presidents being pro-business. The spoil system was an illegal practice after the Pendleton Civil Service Act abolished it. There was a small glimpse of it, however, when President Harding appointed 2 friends, Albert Fall and Charles Forbes, as fellow government workers. I want to go to the phone lines to see if you guys have any questions concerning this topic. The number is 414-799-1620 or the Accunet Mortgage toll-free talk line at 800-877-1620. Let's go to Steve in Brookfield. Steve, you're up first on 620 WTMJ.
Thanks for taking my call, Anshul. I'm a huge fan of the show, and I'm honored to talk to both of you. So, how specifically was the laissez-faire approach brought back into the government beliefs?
Thanks for the question, Steve. I think I may have forgotten to go more in depth concerning the laissez-faire approach. Well, after President Harding died during his presidency, his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, came into office. He opposed government regulation on big business and stated, "The business of America is business." As stated before, the Republican Party was pro-business, and this exemplifies their beliefs.
Oh, thanks, Anshul and David. That really clears up my confusion.
You're welcome, Steve. Thanks for the call.
We covered a lot in this podcast. Let's give you a brief overview, or conclusion, if you will, of this topic. We first discussed how the laissez-faire approach was developed during the Gilded Age, supporting the idea that government should not regulate big business. Then, we described the spoil system, where government leaders appointed friends into office, usually in exchange for money. During the 1920s, government officials resumed the concept of letting business grow and did appoint a few friends, but they still had to meet a few requirements set forth by the Civil Service Act. Then we discussed the Teapot Dome scandal. It describes the corrupt activity occurring at the Naval Petroleum Reserves. Albert Fall, who had control of these oil reserves because of his status in the Department of the Interior, he accepted bribery from Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny, who would then be allowed to dig and extract oil from the reserves, which were supposed to be for the Navy in case we ran low on oil. Once people suspected wrongdoing, they organized a committee and eventually got help from the Senate, where they would investigate these activities. After investigation took place, they convicted Albert Fall and exonerated Sinclair and Doheny. Sinclair was sentenced, however, because he intimidated jury members.
Next, we discuss Harry Daugherty and Charles Forbes. Harry Daugherty was a corrupt attorney general who launched an investigation on President Harding's corrupt administration, but the U.S. Senate suspected that Daugherty was involved in illegal activities, and they launched an investigation on him. During the investigation, he resigned, even though he was ultimately deemed not guilty. Charles Forbes was a corrupt chairman of the Bureau of Veterans Affairs who was appointed simply because he was a friend of President Harding. This partially was a practice of the spoil system because even though Forbes had to take an exam to get into office, a requirement due to the Pendleton Civil Service Act, he was appointed because he was acquainted with Harding. He embezzled $250 million from the Bureau of Veteran Affairs, and when this was discovered, he received $100,000 in fines and a 2-year prison sentence.
The 18th Amendment abolished the sale, manufacturing, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, but it did not prohibit alcohol consumption. The amendment had success at the beginning, however, those who wanted to continue drinking found illegal ways to do it through bootlegging and speakeasies. Gang violence increased and cultural conflicts began to occur due to different beliefs toward alcohol consumption. In the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt established the 21st Amendment, which ended alcohol abuse and repealed the 18th Amendment. Ted Davis is live from the BMO Harris Bradley Center for the Bucks home opener, and he's next on WTMJ. Thanks for tuning in to our podcast concerning political corruption in the 1920s. Good night, Wisconsin.